All right, it's pie season, and you might ask, when is it ever not pie season? A good question. Summertime in particular, when our fruit is pristine, is a really great time to prepare simple desserts. So we're gonna, in a few minutes, eliminate any apprehension you have about making a pie crust. There's so much hype about vodka and so on and so forth. When it really comes down to it, you probably have what you need right now in your home. It's fat and flour. And the biggest thing is you want to touch it very minimally. You can see I'm not using any equipment. I'm just using a big glass bowl so you can see what I'm making. I have a knife to cut the butter. I have a bench scraper to gather my dough together. And then I'm going to be using my hands. Our ingredients are simply flour, salt, sugar, and ice water. When you do make a short crust pastry, which is what a pie crust category is you want to make sure that everything is really cold because our desired end product is gently flaked together. And if we were using a room temperature butter, it's going to cream and we're not going to get flakes and have it be blended as coarsely. So I'm going to begin by measuring out 1 cup of flour. Now in a typical pie crust recipe, if I was making enough to put in a pie dish, I would use 1.5 cups of flour and 9 tablespoons of butter. Because we have a smaller household, I'm not cooking for people right now, I am going to just make 2/3 of that recipe, so 1 cup's worth of flour. So you notice I filled it up and took the flat side and level it away. Tap that aside. Now I'm going to add just a teeny amount of salt and a teeny amount of sugar in here. I am using a salted butter. This is one of my favorite salted butters from Clover here in California. Because it's salted, I don't need to add much salt additionally. Some are very adamant that they'll never bake with salted butter. Okay. The advantage to unsalted butter is simply that you as the chef has the opportunity to control how much salt goes in. So if you're working with a salted butter, just take note of that and don't add additional salt in there. It's a very, very rare application where you're going to use no salt whatsoever. So you want to use enough salt to bring flavor of everything forward, but not so much that it tastes salty. So 1 cup of flour is going to require that we use 6 tablespoons of butter. There's 8 tablespoons in a stick of butter, and I just am doing 2/3 of that, 2/3 of the recipe, hence 6 tablespoons. So I am going to take 3/4 of my stick of butter, cut this into coarse chunks. So of my 6 tablespoons, I'm going to cut these into tablespoons and then cut the tablespoons into quarters. I intentionally want to have my butter have some size on it. And the reason for that is that I'm going to be blending this together into the flour. And if it's crumbled too small, I'm not giving an opportunity for the flour to get wrapped around the butter bits and mixed together. Similarly, if I just cut them into hunks, like if I just cut my 6 tablespoons in half, that's going to require too much work, and too much work is at the compromise of your flakes. So 1/4 tablespoon is the perfect size. Now, what's really important when you make a crust, and this is true of biscuits, it's true of shortcakes, is that everything needs to be cold. We want to cut our flour and our fat into the flour. And when this is done, I'm going to have piecey little bits that remain. That is necessary to achieve flakes. One of the biggest things to understand about butter, which is butter's advantage, but sometimes to its detriment, is that butter contains water. I'm using a regular grocery store butter. It's going to be about 16% water. European style butters are going to be about 9 to 10% water. That stored water is actually what helps us get lift in our pastry, because that stored water is going to turn to steam when our pastry goes into the oven. And as that steam rises, it almost like an accordion stretches up the flakes in your pastry. So to that end, you're actually better to use a grocery store butter than you are to use a European style butter here. It's also why using a dense fat, i.e. a shortening or a liquid fat like a oil or coconut oil, is not going to achieve as much flakes as you would get with butter itself. So I'm using my fingertips here, and I'm just coarsely grabbing the butter bits and kind of smearing them and squeezing them between the flour. When this is done, it's often, I want it to be piecey bits, and then I'm going to add just a dash of ice water in there. And how much water we use is going to be dependent on everything from how settled my flour is in the container, how wet the butter is. You even need to consider how humid your environment is. And there's not some algorithm you have to run through the day's weather forecast, but simply recognize that there is going to be a range of water. In my standard pie crust recipe with 1.5 cups of flour, I might use between 2 to 4 tablespoons of water. Since I'm doing just a cup of flour here, I might use between 1.5 to 2 tablespoons. So piecey little bits like so. So when this is done, there's still bits of butter, and I still have distinct pieces of flour, but they're all evenly. It's not like I just have butter and flour that haven't been touched all together. So to gauge how much water I'm going to put in here, I want to grab a handful and make a fist. I often describe that I want a texture to rival good sandcastle sand. I want it to be something I'll be able to pack together, but if it's too wet, it's going to crumble right underneath me, and if it's too dry, it won't come together at all. So there's a broad range, but there is a balance there in the middle. So this has no water whatsoever. It looks dry when I grab a handful, but as I squeeze it into a fist, it'll stay held together. Now, this fact that this fell together as it did is an indication I'm going to need a higher amount of water. So I might be looking at 2 tablespoons, maybe 2 1/4 when I mix this all together. So I'm going to add that in right now. So why is everything cold, and why does cold matter? Cold matters because we don't want the butter to get melted into our other ingredients. If it were, then we would just have the texture like we have in cookies, pie crust, scones, in cookies, cakes, where things are blended really smooth. So I'm just scooting this, using my fingers to push this back and forth. If you were with us recently when we did a pizza class, pizza is all about kneading the dough. You stretch it and pull it. This is flat folds, and we don't want to touch it too much. So pizzas and pie crusts are extreme ends of gluten development. Pizza, you do develop the gluten for a good long while. Pie crusts, you handle them very minimally. When I talk about gluten, what I mean is gluten is naturally occurring in flour. It starts to get strong, starts to get strengthened when it mixes with the wet ingredients. So I mix together my flour, my salt, my sugar in a bowl, and I can mix that as much as I want. Until a wet ingredient gets in play, the gluten is not going to start to develop. Once in this case, our wet ingredient was butter, once that starts to join the party, then I have to take care that it doesn't get mixed too much. So this already looks great. I'm going to do just a few folds left to right, top to bottom, and then wrap this in plastic and put it into the fridge. That rest stage is important. I know a lot of times directions can seem like, oh, that's an ideal situation, but what difference does it really make? The answer is a lot. In fact, what I often recommend, say like the first weekend in November, are likely, and normally you're going to be entertaining a bit, is to just make 4 crusts at once. Wrap each one in plastic wrap, then aluminum foil, then in a Ziploc bag, and you'll be able to pull those out as you need to without the need to rest. What the rest does is, even though we handled this minimally, that gluten is developed. Think if you've done a bunch of arm curls, the muscle is strong. You need to give it a chance to recover, otherwise it's going to crack your pastry as it bakes, or it's going to spring back, and you're going to have a lot of shrinkage in your dough. So just like that, flatten into a disc. I'm going to pull out a piece of plastic wrap and then roll this out together. So you make note, this is in a disc and not a ball. Once our next step, where we take it to roll it out to line the tart pan, or in this case, the galette crust. If I had it in a big round ball, it would have to take a lot of friction to get it flat. So it is advantageous to be in a disc versus a ball, so that it will roll out nicely. And once again, I won't overwork the gluten. So just like so, and then into the fridge. So I'm going to put this in the fridge for about 30 minutes. During that time, since I know I'm making this to be used in a galette, I'm going to start breaking down my fruit. And then once the fruit stands, this will be ready to roll out and put the fruit within it. All right, see you back in a few minutes.